All right, we are on air. Dr. Barnes, do you mind if I call you Luke?
Yeah, go for it.
So, Luke, you wrote a book, The Fortunate Universe, and you published a paper in the Australasian Journal of Physics and Cosmology, arguing that the fine-tuning is indicative of a designer or theism as opposed to a naturalistic universe. Can you explain why would that be the case? Because I'm an atheist. I don't understand why the fine-tuning indicates a designer as opposed to just unknown natural stuff.
Well, a couple of things there. The paper was first. It was in Publications of the Astronomical Society of Australia, and there was no design argument there. It was purely just what would happen if we changed the physics of the universe, change these constants of nature, or even change the laws a little bit. So that was entirely a review article. There's loads of papers about that. I had to read about 200 papers in the course of preparing for that one. But then myself and a colleague of mine, Geraint Lewis, wrote our book, A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos, which just sort of fleshed that out at a popular level. Geraint, so we wrote most of the book together except for the last chapter, chapter 8, which is a discussion between us. Geraint's an atheist, so he doesn't think it's a design argument either. So we sort of agree on the science. We agree that fine-tuning as a physical phenomenon is a real thing, but then what does it mean was something we disagreed about. And so the question is, yeah, why would it point to a designer? So there's a couple of ways that people have approached this. The way that I've been sort of thinking about it most recently would be as follows. I mean, whenever you as a scientist, so I'm a cosmologist, whenever you try to think through some idea about how the universe works or some model of something in the universe, when you try and work out whether that's true or not, compare it to data, you ask a question like, if the model was true, if my idea was true, if this theory was true, what would we expect? And so fine-tuning for me is kind of one way of trying to get a handle on this for if we're thinking about naturalism. Now, that's just one of the things we could be thinking about. But given that at least some atheists are naturalists, that's an interesting place to start. If there were a naturalistic universe, what sort of naturalistic universe would we expect? And so one of the things you do in your models is you look at all the sort of possibilities and see of the way things could have turned out, or the way the experiments could have turned out, and see whether yours explains the way things actually turned out. And I think what fine-tuning shows is that what sort of universe would we expect on naturalism? Well, let's just create a set of other ways the universe could have been on naturalism by changing these constants, and then seeing which ones of those have things in common with our universe, like life, like permitting the existence of any kind of complex observer. And we find that fraction is astonishingly small. And so the way, so naturalism then would expect with overwhelming sort of likelihood a dead universe. And so when your theory expects a certain way of things which is not the way things actually are, then it gets penalized. The other half of that's got to be an argument along the lines of, all right, what would we expect if God created a universe? And I don't know a lot of theists who lose too much sleep about this. It seems obvious to us, at least, even if not to the atheist. Although this is what we talk about. It's not totally improbable that God would want to create a universe that had beings in it who are capable of morally significant actions, for example. And so if you think that that's even remotely likely, 1 in a billion likely, then that's still puts it well ahead of naturalism, if we're thinking of just a shootout between those two. So that's roughly where things are at the moment. There's 1,000 objections that can be raised at any point.
Yeah, so my objection would be there are infinitely many ways the universe could be, but there's also infinitely many ways a God could be. So you're picking a specific kind of a God who would create this kind of a universe. Can't we say that there is a particular kind of a universe or a particular kind of a natural undiscovered law that would be conducive of the kind of universe we see in the same kind of way?
So there's two things there. On this straight shirt, so the idea here is, I mean, if you have a continuum of possibilities, x between 0 and 1, you need some way of sort of handling those. So we do that with a measure. there's an infinite number of points in this square, but I can still measure its area. So the way to get at that is via these probabilities. You just got to lay out you lay out the question properly in light of some sort of reasonable metric. And yes, there's a whole heap of ways the universe could have been, and a whole heap of ways God could have been. But if we sort of create a level playing field between naturalism and theism, then the question we've got to ask is, all right, what's the probability of a life-permitting universe on naturalism? And we can ask that within the context of the constants. We're going to lay out the sort of measures that we put down as physicists to answer that question, and out comes a number. The number is ludicrously small. And then when we ask it about theism, there's a whole heap of ways God could be, but we're only dealing with the most general properties. We don't need to know every minute detail of what God was doing on Thursday, the 24th of March last year or something, right? It's, would God want to, a God who would want to create a universe that has morally agents like us, that are moral agents in it. What do you think the probability of that is? It's not about counting possibilities, but how you weight those different probabilities. The second part of that was couldn't we find some sort of natural law that makes life probable on a naturalistic understanding? So there's a couple of things to say to that. Interestingly, this is one of the things that Geraint and I actually agreed about. But this is not probably not the answer to fine tuning. Geraint leads towards a multiverse. I don't want to give away the ending of the book, but that's roughly what's going on. Could there be some sort of naturalistic universe which must create life or makes life more likely? Well, there's a couple of things. One, all we need there is some mathematical model, right? That's all we need to find to know that that's a possibility. And the fact that that no one has yet, despite all of the theoretical physics we've done thus far, like we don't even have a toy model or half a model or sort of a vague idea about, like, no one has a clue how you make a universe which is totally simple and basic and no fine-tuning of its basic parts, which then goes on to make something complex like life. So, for example, in the book in chapter 6, we discuss cellular automata, which is basically you have a two-dimensional world, which is like a chessboard, right? Just discrete places you can be, and then things move around on the chessboard. And even in those sorts of ultra, that's not our universe, that's something else. Even in that sort of universe, you've still got to fine-tune the laws if you want something interesting. So, for example, there are certain rules you can set down for the way the squares blink on and off, where you can actually, inside that world, create what's called a universal Turing machine. You can make any computer code inside that world, which is kind of amazing. Conway's Game of Life is what this is called. But it seems like only a very small fraction of the possible rules that you could lay down in that world will give you that sort of outcome.
Right. Stephen Hawking argued that, well, maybe the boundary conditions aren't arbitrary like you're describing. Maybe they're all somehow interconnected, and so any change to one boundary condition would create a proportional change to the others, and so all the boundary conditions can be interconnected by some unknown law that we haven't discovered yet. So it seems like we could make a universe that is equally likely to produce what we see around us, which includes life, as it would be under a God hypothesis. So God has this moral property that produces a universe like we see, and we can say that there's some kind of a natural, undiscovered property of the universe that produces a universe like we want it to be.
Okay, but be careful with what you're asking here. So the fine-tuning argument is not saying that the natural laws that we have are unlikely to produce life. That's not it. It's that it's unlikely that you will get brackets natural laws that produce life. So it's not a question of whether we can find a possibility which will make life nice and easy. Like, if you want a universe that has laws that create life, we've got one. It's this one, right? And within some limits, you can change the constants and still be fine. So remember, I mean, we had this sort of playing field, which is let's change the constants and see what happens. And so the question is, maybe, I mean, we don't think that's the end of physics, right? But that's at least a playing field where we can ask these questions properly, right? The question is, all right, what if in future physics we end up on a different playing field where the values of these constants are explained by a whole heap of things, symmetry, something happening at a deeper level. right? Or even the multiverse you could stick in down there. Okay, the problem is you're now explaining one level of physics in terms of another level of physics, and I'm fine with that. There's no problem. The theist doesn't have a problem with that. Well, it shouldn't. What we want to do then is just take our question of what universe we would expect, which we asked up here, and move the whole question down a level. Not ask whether this level explains that level, but okay, here's this level of physics that we now know. Let's try and generate a set of possibilities, right, to have a look around and then say, is our sort of universe what we would expect on naturalism and what we would expect on theism? So the problem with that answer is, so there will be deeper physics, right? But the question we want to ask is, what will we expect? And we just can't do that until we've got the deeper physics.
Right, I'm just positing a hypothetical and saying I have this hypothetical theory in my head that there is this super law of nature that determines all the boundary conditions, and it would produce a life-permitting universe exactly like what we would see, or within a range near like what we would see. So can't I do that? And just like you're presenting this idea of a designer who has these properties which can explain everything we see around us in, as a more likely outcome than just random chance, I can do the same thing and present a naturalist hypothesis that there is this super law of nature that determines the boundary conditions to be within a range that would produce a universe like ours. Can't I do the same thing?
So, okay, one of the ways you sort of want to attack this is say, we're trying to ask the question, why is the universe the way it is rather than some other way? And so pointing out one particular possibility, even if that has all these wonderful properties that you say, and like, this is every physicist's dream, right? You're on the bus, you get a wonderful idea, you get out the pen and paper, and then, a couple of pages of algebra later, you've derived the mass of the electron or something, right? That's Nobel Prize winning material. If I could do that, I'd have done it, right? That's the stuff we dream of doing. So we're like all in favor of that, absolutely. The question we just ask in that, every time physics progresses, yes, we get a deeper understanding of why things are the way they are, but we're still always faced with this question, why is it this way rather than some other way? And that's asking a question that physics doesn't usually ask, right? I mean, it's really asking about why. So if you want to say that there's this super law that sort of answers that question, that super law is going to have to not just describe how things are, but describes how things must be in some sense, right? There's some way, right? I mean, the problem with fine-tuning was there was all these other dead possibilities. We want to get rid of those. So we need something to tell us that they couldn't have happened, right? To rule them out so that they don't go into this probability calculation. So if there was this deeper super law, the question would be, why that super law rather than some other super law? And in particular, obviously, if it describes our universe, it allows for life, right? Why it would be a life-permitting law. And we'd ask, at the level of that law, is it a rare property of those sorts of laws that they're life-permitting, or is it a common property? And that's the question we'd love to ask. And as soon as we get that law, we'll ask it. The problem is we just don't know. I mean, it might just be, given that physics just describes the way things are, there's no guarantee, or so far as I can tell, even expectation that a higher level law that explains the universe better is necessarily going to make things less fine-tuned, right? They'll explain, here's the law, here's the constants. They'll explain the constants, right? But they've just opened up a whole new possibility space down here.
Right. Can't I say the same thing about God, though, and say, well, even if we have a designer or a God, that doesn't solve the problem because the designer could be designed. What designed the designer? Why does the designer have the properties that it does?
So in this level, so there's two ways to attack this. There's the way where you go, all right, here's everything theologians have said for the 2000s, 3000, 4 whatever 1,000 years before the fine-tuning argument came along. Or we can just try and let me just try and do the other process. Let's just try and keep things general. The difference here is how do we want to put this? When we ask things at the level of the constants of nature as we know them, when we look at that set of possibilities, what naturalism has to say is, all right, there's no other principle that we know of reality. So we're kind of probability theorists call this a non-informative distribution. It's like guessing. It's as if random, although I don't want to say it's stochastic. You know, there's some giant mechanical arm that picks out a possibility. Versus what would we expect on theism? Now, when we drop down a level, we'd want to do the same. But the difference is when we keep the same playing field and we look at all the constants, what theism puts over that constant, so if you're just sort of thinking on a most general level, is not like a random distribution, but one that depends on the outcome. That's something that could happen because you've got a mind, or something that's more like a mind than anything else we know, right? We can just keep things at that general level. You would try and divide up that possibility space, not in terms of the values of the constants, but in terms of the outcomes that are possible. So you could say, okay, maybe God likes black holes or not black holes, or life or not life, or empty space, not empty space, loves a big crunch, hates a big crunch. You can do all of that dividing up, but that's fine. You know, those sorts of, each of those divisions only sort of cuts things at best in half. And if you think of, not even in half, it's linear, right? I mean, if there's sort of 10 options or 100 options, and the probability of, oh, he wants life is then 1 in 100 at worst. I mean, that's a ridiculously naive sort of, no theologian ever does that sort of argument, right? That's how a physicist tries to do it. But on that sort of level, you're not laying down a distribution over the fundamental level of the universe, like the mass of the electron, mass of the quarks, or whatever might be in that deeper level of physics, right? God, when you think about God and the universe, you're thinking about God's intentions for the universe and about what they might be. So actually, if we went down to that deeper level, things probably wouldn't change. If you think it was likely that God would make a universe whose outcome at the end of the day would be known physics as we know it and life, then that's not going to change as we move down. On the other half of that, I mean, there is the entire history of theology and a whole heap of theologians who argued that we would expect God to create because, God is good and, he's not under any compulsion because God is also free, but it's hardly an unlikely thing that God would make a universe like that.
Right, so I would respond by saying we have this necessary being, God, who has certain properties that make it conducive to produce a universe like ours that has moral life in it. But can't I just make the inverse argument for like naturalistic pantheism, just an eternal, all-powerful, necessary nature? And this naturalistic pantheism has these properties that make it likely to produce a universe like ours, but just for different reasons, not intentional reasons. It's just properties of its nature that make it likely to produce this universe, just like God has properties of its nature that make it likely to produce this universe.
Okay, so you're either gonna, so my suspicion is one of two things is gonna happen, right? You either just put a different label on God, in which case just come on over. The water's fine. So in particular, naturalistic pantheism. The way I'm thinking of naturalism is that the universe is all there is.
All right, let me clarify that just for a second.
Yeah, go for it.
So in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, naturalistic pantheism has a section that is just the natural universe. That's all there is. It's just the necessary property of the eternal or all-powerful, but no consciousness. So it can have some of the properties of God, but not the consciousness property of God. So it's still the necessary thing. There's just no consciousness to it.
Okay. See, for me, what makes the difference in this argument is when I think, sorry, when I think about, let's just keep things at the level of the constants. And I've got these 31 constants of nature. They're not all fine-tuned, by the way, as in, it's not true that you have to land in a really small area with all of them in order to get life right, but there's enough of them where you do need to do that. And then you think, okay, whatever my hypothesis is, I've got to put some sort of distribution over these constants. In this, what would I expect is basically what we're trying to ask. If it's just pure straight up naturalism, I think, it's got to be just, spread evenly, or non-informative, or something that, there's no other way of carving up the space that wouldn't require, that's not either just cheating by looking at the answer, or would require an extra principle that you add into your pantheism. So into your, naturalism. And so you've got this side where I'm going to spread everything evenly, and then there's theism where I'm going to say, all right, let's apply things according to a metric where what matters is conscious, maybe. What matters is a mind's intention for the universe. Okay, and you don't have to be totally certain about what that is, as I was saying, like black holes, not black holes. We can work that out over here. So if there's no conscious intention for the universe over here, over in whatever you've constructed of naturalism, it seems to me you can't then lay down a distribution which depends on the outcome of the universe, about what happens in the end. So you can't have a version of naturalism in which black holes are more likely because something likes black holes. Like, what do you mean by that, right? Black holes could be more likely for ordinary physical reasons, but not for that outcome is what was wanted to be created. On the other hand, so the question is, what extra, when you throw pantheism into the mix, naturalistic pantheism, what extra principle are you throwing in there that's going to change the way I put down my probabilities over this side, that's going to make all the difference? And one of the problems is, this is within Bayesian probability theory, you don't get to, I mean, these are all, we've been talking so far about what are called likelihoods, probability of the evidence given the theory and some background information, right? The problem with the reason why we look at likelihoods is they're usually the easiest thing to calculate. But in terms of where we are, they're always backwards, right? Probability of the evidence given the theory, that's not where we are. We know the evidence, we want the theory, right? So the most important one's called the posterior, probability of the theory given the evidence. There's ways to fool the likelihood where you say, all right, I'm going to take my theory, I'm going to put this extra little assumption into it, and suddenly it's going to do a whole lot better with regards to this evidence. Suddenly my likelihood's going to shoot right up and things are going to look great. That's entirely possible. The likelihood is fooled, but when you go and do the whole thing, probability of the theory given the evidence, the posterior, you have to fold into that the probability of this extra assumption. You don't get that for free. And so if you want to say something like as a most sort of crude way of doing this, okay, what about naturalism, but there's some naturalistic principle that the universe must contain life at the end of the day, right? The universe must produce life at some point, okay? If you throw that in, that suddenly your likelihood looks amazing. What's the probability of a life-permitting universe given naturalism and a naturalistic love of life, right? That suddenly looks amazing. You've got to then throw in what's the probability of the term that's going to end up in the calculus is what's the probability of the extra principle given naturalism. So, and it seems to me that that will just be the fine-tuning probability all over again. You've just shifted it from one term to another, and you're still sunk. So, for example, the way you might want to think about that is, okay, I've just got pure naturalism. What's the probability that there's some principle that likes life? Well, that's the kind of principle we've never seen before. You might want to start thinking about, okay, well, what about the constants? If we look at all the constants, what if it just chose those at random? And then there's fine-tuning again. One of the reasons why that would be really weird is because we usually think of the laws of nature as dynamic. So you have a starting point and then off they go into the future. And that would be kind of, for human beings, any mind can do something that looks like, it looks like causation from the future. You study for 3 years and then you get a diploma. Well, why did you start studying? to get the diploma. So the diploma calls the studying back in time. That's something a mind can do by intending. It's not something that nature does. Let me say that. It's not something that, if you're a naturalist, the fundamental matter of the universe does, unless you've put some pretty weird properties into it. But I should say, I've been talking with a guy called Philip Goff, who's a cosmopanpsychist. Is that a word? It's cosmopanpsychism. So I guess that makes him a cosmopanpsychist. So he wants to put, I guess it's one step up from naturalistic pantheism. He wants to put consciousness in everything. And then that will explain fine-tuning, and then he won't have to deal with the problem of evil, and then, hey presto, he's beaten naturalism. And theism, he thinks. So, you know, that seems like a slightly bonkers idea to me, but it appeals to some people.
So I would apply, why would it be any less likely that pantheism has this property? And I wouldn't say that it's to produce life. It just interconnects all of the boundary conditions to produce a universe like ours, which just happens to produce life. So it's not for life. It just, this super law just interconnects the boundary conditions, so they couldn't be sufficiently different than what we see. And why would pantheism having this property be any less likely than God having the property of being moral? Like, it could be an immoral God, or an amoral God, or a deist God, or God that really likes spaghetti or something. There could just be infinitely many. So I don't see the difference between those probabilities.
Okay, so a God that likes spaghetti, that's a good one. The easiest way to make spaghetti is probably to make humans first, right? Rather than just some cosmic. Anyway, here's an illustration that I quite like. So someone really well, Jane shuffles a deck of cards really well, okay? And I wish I had some here. I don't think I do. Deals out 5 cards, and it's generic hand of cards: two of clubs, 5 of spades, king of hearts. No particular. It seems like no particular pattern. And then now you're thinking about, okay, what does that mean? It probably means that Jane didn't rig the shuffle in any way that we were totally unaware of. She just randomly shuffled, and those are the cards that came out. Or maybe she's, she has perfect shuffling rigging abilities, and she has a real preference for the 2 of whatever I said, the 2 of clubs, the 5 of diamonds, the king of spades. Look that up in case I probably got those wrong. Those 5 cards. So on the face of it, when you start looking at likelihoods, you say, okay, what's the probability that those 5 cards came out at random if she's just shuffling randomly, and it's 52 choose 5, which right? And so that likelihood looks really small. And then you go, okay, what's the likelihood on this second principle? Well, it's 1, right? Because she's got the skills to produce whatever she likes, and she loves that particular thing. So does that mean that second probability is now much more likely? Well, no. Like I said, this other probability, when you go to the posterior, what's the probability of these two possibilities? This extra probability term comes up. And you've got to say, okay, given that she has a fondness for some particular 5 cards, what's the probability that it's these 5 cards? Okay. And so that probability, right, if you've got no reason to think that those 5 cards are special, that probability that she likes these 5 cards, given that she has some special preference, is the same probability. It's that 1 over 2.5 million again. And so on that level, those 2 probabilities just cancelled out. And so given that we think it's a priori more likely that she's just some random shuffler and she's got these amazing skills, we just go with that one. And the probability of that hand just didn't figure into it at all. So with this case, so what's the probability that there's some underlying scheme that makes our universe completely likely, and then the life permitting thing is totally at random? Unless you've got a specific proposal, you've got to say, okay, what's the probability that it's our universe is the one that the super law wants, rather than all these some other set of universes? Well, what other set of universes can we get a handle on? Well, let's go and change all the constants. All right, what's the probability you get a universe like ours amongst all the constants? Hey, presto, there's fine tuning back again. And so you don't get away from it like that. I mean, the possibility of a deeper principle is not enough. You've got to show us the deeper principle, and then we're in for it, right? So, for example, do that example again with the cards and Jane, right? But out comes the cards, ace, 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 king, right? Okay. And now we start to think, okay, the probability of those cards is if she's shuffling at random, is still 1 in 2.5 million. The difference now is we don't think that if it's now more plausible that if she has a special set of cards she likes, that having 4 aces come out at once might be the answer to that question. And so now when we go for that extra probability that she wants 4 aces, given that she has the skills to pull up any 5 cards, now that doesn't look like random. That doesn't look like the 1 in 2.5 million again. Now we're in a different space. But you need something specific, right? You need some specific principle, not just the possibility of it. That doesn't work. You need something like, there's a pattern in those cards. That card wins just about any hand of poker, something like that, right? In this example, that's what it is. So I don't think this works in the abstract. I think you would need something concrete for this to be obvious. Otherwise, what it looks like is we'll go to some deeper level of physics. We'll lose this plane of just varying constants. We'll start varying laws, but fine-tuning might come back for all we know.
Right, I totally agree. And I'm saying what it looks like to me, what the theist is doing is exactly that. They're supposing this philosophical abstract property that a god may have that can produce a universe just like ours. And I'm just doing the same thing without the god. I can make up an equally philosophical abstract property that can produce a universe just like ours without a god.
Okay, the problem with that is, so think about the cards again. We didn't have any sort of thought before that the 2 of diamonds, the 5 of spades, the king of hearts, that was anything special. We made that up after the fact, given what the cards were. So the problem with the proposal, as you've put it, is that you had to reference this universe in that. So you've sort of had to cheat ahead of time and say maybe there's some principle that somehow arrives at this universe, which is just like maybe there's some principle that arrives at those weird set of 5 cards, rather than some abstract principle that actually gives, something about this universe that's physically more likely. So I think the fact then I'd sort of move towards, look, there's a couple of millennia of theists believing that, God is the ultimate good, or morally perfect, or just is the good, or however you cash that out, whether you're a Greek or a Thomist, or I don't even, whatever. In that case, as a morally good outcome, like human beings, would be, not particularly unlikely. And so at least that has the advantage of being well ahead of time, rather than the sort of, there's something a bit ad hoc about saying there's some principle that leads to this universe. You've had to look at the hand you've been dealt before you could propose the principle.
Well, so my response to that would be like, suppose, how is that different from Greeks looking at lightning and saying, well, we can imagine that there is a purpose to the lightning. And so we can suppose it was created by Zeus for the purpose of hitting that guy in the middle of the field because Zeus didn't like that guy. As opposed to the naturalist who says, no, I'm just going to go with it, some unknown natural thing. Isn't your argument the same as the Greek arguing that lightning is created by Zeus?
So the lightning is created by Zeus specifically to hit that guy. So we can think through that with the same set of principles. I think it would be relevant to that sort of argument. Okay, is lightning just a random something purely governed by physical causation? Or is there some sort of intentional cause behind it? All right, so go look at the pattern of lightning strikes, right? I mean, if tomorrow, there were 5 lightning strikes that killed 5 people, all who turned out to be serial murderers, we'd go, what? We'd at least go, that was weird, right? I mean, that's not the way the universe works. But in principle, that argument could work. The reason we don't believe that is because that's not what happens. Moreover, we've got a theory that connects lightning with we have theories of clouds and theories of electromagnetism and all that sort of stuff. So we're talking, in particular, we're talking there about whether one physical phenomenon explains another physical phenomenon, or whether we can just cut that out and throw a God in there on top. The reason I think the fine-tuning argument is different to, say, all the intelligent design arguments, which I take to be in some form or another saying, look, here's life. This is not the kind of thing that would happen if there were only natural causes happening in the universe. That's the structure of the argument, right? That's not the structure of the fine-tuning argument. We're trying to get back to the point where, I mean, what we'd love to do is to have physics totally finished, right? We just know everything there is to know about the universe. We're done. We've solved all its laws. And then we ask, okay, here's the particular way our universe is. Why isn't it one of these other ways? And then we can sort of attack the problem at that level, right? We're sort of jumping in at the level we can when we address it with the level of the constants, but that's where we're going. We're not asking, is this physical phenomenon capable of producing that one? So I think that the case with Zeus, you ask what your expectations are. If you had a god who loved hitting people, especially bad people, with lightning, what is the probability that you would get this pattern of strikes? Versus if it were just a property of clouds and electromagnetism and those sorts of things, what would you expect for the pattern of strikes? And you match those up, and the scientific explanation wins. I'm not going to say the naturalistic one because I'm a theist and I'm fine with that side, right? But I think the answer to ones like that is, okay, let's just run through the same structure of the argument. And I think in that case, it doesn't come out for Zeus.
Well, couldn't you just say the same thing and come up with a being who had the intentionality to do whatever happened? Say, well, it happened this way, and there is some being who has some desire to make it happen this way. And if you put in specifics like that, you can seem like you can explain away anything using that kind of explanation.
There's always a theory that so there's an analogy here with if you have some data, suppose you're measuring some quantity X. The temperature of the day, so you have all the temperatures, right? What's the probability distribution for that? And one of the things you might want to do, so you have all these numbers, right? 10, 15, 100 in Celsius or Fahrenheit, whatever. One of the things you want to do as a scientist is say, all right, we're more likely in some range or some other range, so you draw a histogram. That's one way of trying to approximate what's the distribution underneath. One of the things you might be tempted to do with probability theory is to say, okay, I'm sort of approximating some continuous thing by this histogram. What if I just ask the question, okay, what's the shape of the curve that makes this set of data points most likely, most probable? Okay, and that seems like a perfectly well-suited asked question. The probability is that the problem is that the answer to that is that you just have a perfectly sharp spike at all the data points, and then that explains everything absolutely perfectly. So for any data, there is always a theory that perfectly explains it, and it's the data itself. You just take whatever theory you like, and then you get the data itself, and you staple it on, and then you say, what's the probability of the data given this theory I've constructed, and hey presto, it's perfect. So this is why Bayes won't let you do that sort of thing. Probability theory won't let you do that. It's why the Jane just likes those 5 cards hypothesis doesn't work, because you've just stapled the data onto your theory, and so you need a specific. There's got to be some specific reason why those 5 cards, like for the 4 aces.
Right, exactly. So if we take God and applied this standard to him and say we've discovered God, we've met him, we know he has these properties of he's personal, he's a mind, has intentionality, he's moral, all powerful, all knowing, necessary, whatever. We can take those and say, well, why these properties? Aren't these properties equally fine tuned? Couldn't they be just any other properties?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, good. Okay, so on one level, so it depends at this point who you ask. There is an entire there's an entire line of reasoning that really goes back sort of to Aristotle, and then gets picked up by Christians in the Middle Ages under Thomas Aquinas, and they're still around to this day, which sort of picks up that whole thing all the way through, which says that ultimate reality. There's 5 words that we use to describe it, but they're really different aspects of the same thing. They're not 5 separate things. So I've now got to remember, I'm not really sort of signed on to Thomism, but I'm just trying to remember what they are. It's being, truth, unity, goodness, and beauty. So the ultimate reality is something that exists. It has being because it's ultimate reality. It's obviously truth because all truth must ultimately ground in whatever exists. It must be one thing. There's some Thomistic argument for that. And anyway, that's the argument for unity. I can't quite remember. The definition of beauty is sort of connected to goodness. Beauty is not just some emotion that humans have. Beauty is an actual property of things where they're reflecting goodness. But goodness is in there simply because I sound like I'm a million miles away. I'll try and get back to the question quickly. The argument goes something like this. So things have a certain, within Aristotle, things have a certain, the things they actually are and the things they potentially are. So I actually have a beard. I'm potentially clean shaven. I could go and shave the beard off, right? There's a true human for anything that they sort of have their own true nature of what they really are, right? So the beard is not part of my essential nature because I can shave it off and I'm still me. But there is something about humans, about everything, which is its true nature. And when it achieves that, it sort of achieved its perfect actual state with no less possibilities left. And so the higher you are towards that thing that you're supposed to be, goodness, the more you are towards being rather than non-being, the more you are towards actuality rather than potentiality. And so the closer you are to God. And so if you understood all of that and you're on board with that, you're a Thomist, I sort of fall off the wagon at some point, not quite understanding, but that's their sort of argument. There's other theological traditions which get to the same sort of idea of saying, okay, if there is this thing called ultimate reality, assigning to it the ultimate standard of goodness and morality as well is something that we would expect. We wouldn't expect there to be some ultimate being, but then goodness is just something that we invented. Obviously, if God is interested in ultimate things, then ultimate, what is good? What is the good, as Plato said, all those sorts of things which are there in the Greeks before they're in the Christians. They're obviously there in Judaism as well and a whole heap of other religions. There's a very good book on this, which might be slightly hard going, especially if you find that whole Thomas thing hard going, by David Bentley Hart called, I'm going to look it up. Anyway, his point is that there's something interesting about religions that they have in common, even east to west, not just within the monotheistic Western religions, is that it's called the experience of God. There it is. What's the subtitle? But the point he makes there, and he knows these religions a lot better than I do, so he can answer this better than I can, is that there's sort of 3 things that they all put into God. That God is the source of being. God is, existence is the thing that he grounds. Consciousness, that as a thinking thing, thinking is not something that inanimate matter does. It's something that is sort of higher than that. And then what he calls bliss, which is sort of the ultimate in happiness and goodness and all those sorts of things. So, at very least, it doesn't seem like it. To me, it's more like the four aces principle than the let's just stick wherever we are and put it in God principle, that we would assign goodness to God.
So my response to that would be, even if I grant goodness exists, I agree that there has to be some necessary thing. I'm with you on that part. But even if I grant goodness exists, that could just be an undiscovered law of nature that we just don't understand yet. I don't see any reason that would be some kind of intrinsic property of the necessary thing. It could just be an offshoot, or like an undiscovered law of nature that's moral, or there could just be like a necessary, eternal, all-powerful pantheism. There doesn't seem any reason that necessitates the consciousness to be a part of that, or the intentionality, whichever way you want to put it.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Two things there. The problem I'd have with saying, so, I have physics textbooks lying around, right? And there's nothing in there that really looks, well, there's no equations that look like a moral principle. I mean, granted, you're not saying that that's the case, but when you say, okay, maybe there's some ultimate principle which is moral, I don't really know what that means. I love, there's a story at this point. There's a really good book, John Haldane and JCC Smart. Atheism versus Theism. Smart tells the following story. It used to be a bit of a fashion within philosophy that if someone was talking and it counted as being a criticism of them if you put your hand up and said, I don't understand. Because this meant that they were being vague, they weren't being clear enough, concise enough. And so Smart says, he was in a seminar, he must have been quite young, and someone tried this on Bertrand Russell. And Russell just says, I'm not responsible for your intellectual deficiencies, young man, and just burns him out. In this case, I'm sort of putting up my hand and saying, I don't know what you mean when you say there's a physical principle that governs morality.
Right. Right. Actually,
maybe that's my intellectual deficiencies. If you want to shoot that one back at me, feel free.
Well, how does God ground the morality? Is it are you familiar with the Euthyphro dilemma? Is something good because of God's nature, or is it good because of His commands? So you're probably going to say it's something like it's grounded in God's nature, right? Goodness is good because it's grounded in God's nature. Is that accurate?
I'd say character, but I'd probably close enough that yeah.
So can't I just say the same thing?
In particular, it's not God's will which cuts out one of the things. It's not that God decides. So yeah, go on.
Right. So since it's not that God decides, it's some property of His nature, His being. And so it seems like I can say the same thing, that there's just some property of naturalistic pantheism, which is this moral law. And it can also ground morality in the same way. Now, I think neither of those makes sense in either way, but they can equally not make sense for both.
At this point, you're a long way from... So I think there's a couple of things there. One is if you started this journey as I'm just your run-of-the-mill Dawkins-style atheist naturalist, maybe even Sean Carroll-style naturalist, by which I mean you actually know how to do some philosophy and you've thought through things properly rather than just the Dawkins style. If we have to arrive at, okay, we've got theism, I can get something which is on par with that, and we've got to go with naturalistic pantheism where there's some moral principle. It's basically all of theism, but the thing we call God isn't conscious. That's all. I'm going to take that whole side. I'm just going to cut consciousness out. Then fine-tuning's done something pretty interesting if we've arrived there, and we couldn't really expect it to do much more. At this point, we hand things over to, how do we decide between theism and pantheism? That's a pretty interesting thing. Anyway, but if we want to go in that direction, fine-tuning is not going to help us decide, just the way it wouldn't help us decide between the God of Christianity and Islam, right? It's not going to. But thinking about that on that side of things, I'm going back to so let's take the example of maybe I am a Thomist underneath it all. there's a way. So the Thomas wants to say, whenever you say something about God, you either say something sort of negative, like he has no limit to his power or something like that. Or if you say something positive about God, like God is, I mean that not negative in a moral sense, just in the way it's constructed sense. If you say something positive like God is loving, where you haven't got to stick a not in the sentence, you always use that analogously. So there's three ways to use language if you're a Thomist. There's, if I say there is rain today and it will rain tomorrow, when I use those two words rain, I mean them in exactly the same way. Right? If I say I love my kids and I love ice cream, well, hang on. So if I say I love my kids and the tennis score is 1 love, I'm using those completely separately, right? They just happen to be the same noise. But there's this middle case where if I love my kids and I love ice cream, I'm not saying the same thing, but I'm not saying a totally different thing either. It's kind of it's an analogy. Like, you know, I'm delighted when my kids turn up. I'm delighted when some ice cream turns up. There's some sort of analogy going on. So the Thomist says, whenever we say something positive about God, we're saying something analogous. So if we say God has consciousness, we're saying there's something about God which is analogous to the consciousness that goes on in our mind. Now, especially if you're a Thomist and you think, as almost all of them do, so far as I know, that God is, for example, timeless, what you don't mean by consciousness is that God has thoughts one after another, or that God has a brain which is ticking away, or something like that. So actually how God is conscious is an interesting kind of question, but because it's analogous, you're not looking for a complete match between the two, right? Like, you know, rain today, rain tomorrow, we're conscious, God's conscious. You're not looking at that perfect thing. So the question is whether consciousness, let's try and think about whatever ultimate necessary thing might be out there. If it's got either a fondness for this universe or a moral universe or something like that, it seems like if it's then the cause of this universe, it has to have something like intentionality. It set the conditions at the beginning because later on they would produce X, Y, and Z. That might be enough of an analogy to consciousness that you just say, all right, that'll do. That sort of tips the scale over towards theism rather than sort of consciousness-free pantheism. But again, these are not. I'm an astronomer. This is not my wheelhouse.
Well, my main point here is that just like you can say something is done because there's some intentionality or some consciousness, that intentionality or consciousness is determined by its nature. So it makes decisions for a reason. And that reason is determined just like a natural law is determined. So just like you can say there's some consciousness that will produce some outcome for some intentionality, I can say there is just a necessary outcome of some properties of nature that is going to produce the same outcome. So essentially, the main point I'm getting at here is that whenever you attribute metaphysical properties to anything, which means like all-powerful, all-knowing, necessary, divine aseity, pure actuality, any of those kinds of stopping points for truth where there's nothing beyond it, you can attribute those to just anything. Instead of theism, it could be deism or pantheism or polytheism or Pastafarianism or panpsychism, like you mentioned earlier, the cosmic panpsychist you were talking to.
Yeah.
And so you can just apply these to anything you want, and once they have these properties, they can just solve any problem. You can just explain anything in the universe, kind of like the string theory. Let's just explain everything because this is just an alternate property that just applies to everything. Because from my perspective, there's nothing in human knowledge that can justify any of those necessary properties. Like if you claimed, are you familiar with metaphysical naturalism, the position that there's just absolutely no supernatural?
Yeah.
So even given all of the evidence of the natural world, that doesn't show there is no supernatural. There could always just be more that we haven't discovered yet. And that same thing applies to a God. If you said like there is only one God, well, for the same reason, we can't justify that claim. Even if we had as much evidence for this God as we do for the natural world, there could always just be another one that's more powerful or more good or that created this one or has any of those necessary properties. And so it seems to me that anytime you attribute these necessary properties to any explanation, it's just arbitrary. And I can just attribute it to naturalistic pantheism and solve the same problems, just coming at it from a different direction.
Okay, I think what I'd say to that is, let's zero in on the metaphysical naturalism. Which I just call, I don't like the term methodological naturalism, so I just call it naturalism. Anyway, there's a difference between what you can prove, what's possibly true, and what's the most likely thing to be true. And so you can be a naturalist and just say, all right, whatever I observe, that's just part of the natural law. There's a school of thought on philosophy of science, which is the modern day Humeans who follow Hume, who just say, look, the fundamental stuff is just all the stuff that's out there, and there's things happen. This is just the mosaic of events. And then we come along and say, oh, is there some nice way I can just sort of summarize this? Right? Can I take cheat notes on the universe to summarize it for the exam later? And it turns out that there are, and those are what we call the laws of nature. But it's our summary of what's going on. It seems like if you took that approach, you could, any, as you said, any event that happened would seem like, it would just happen because of some natural cause. The problem is, in practice, that would seem to get unlikely if you thought it was a nice law of nature that dead bodies never rise from the grave, except for this one guy, this one time, right? I mean, at some point you've got to say, all right, if I'm going to be a naturalist, I'm okay with a law like dead bodies don't rise after 3 days. Am I really all right with the one which says dead bodies don't rise after 3 days, except for this one guy, this one time, right? I mean, taking that to a ridiculous extreme, even if God existed, he could do nothing to dissuade you from metaphysical naturalism. This is a problem I keep coming back to Bayesian theory. If you give your theory, if you ever give it a probability of 1, certainty, the problem is nothing else can ever change that. It always stays 1 in the light of any future evidence. And so I think the answer to that is then don't give your theory a probability of 1. Right? Don't give any theory a probability. Don't give theism a probability of 1. So I think the problem with that is that you're in a position where no amount of evidence would change your mind. So I think there's in epistemology, I think there should be an evidence that a course of action which would consistently lead you to the wrong answer is not a good course of action. So a principle which, even if God existed and used every bit of his power to try to convince you and you still wouldn't change your mind, is, in light of every possible bit of evidence in that scenario, that's not, something's gone wrong there behind the scenes. So I think the question is I think you're right, but only in the sense that there's no proofs. We're not doing maths. But I think things like the fine-tuning argument do start to put together a case for, okay, which one best explains the data? Which one would lead us to expect the universe that we see? Naturalism on that level gives us nothing, because there's no principle sort of above the laws of nature if you're just a pure naturalist, right? If you're not trying to sort of stick a bit of pantheism on the side. All right, let's take that. Is this the kind of universe we would expect on theism? We can at least try and answer that question.
All right, I totally agree. I think that if we're just going with the natural known physics, then there's nothing that really indicates any metaphysical properties at all. I think it's just an unknown. But it seems like if you add in metaphysical properties to like a bean, it seems like the scientists could just do the same thing and say, okay, well, we'll add metaphysical properties to our pantheism model and just do the same thing. So it seems like the more reasonable thing is just to stick with the known physics and make combinations of different known principles, particles, and laws to build a model of the universe without adding any of these metaphysical properties in to the equation. It seems more reasonable to do physics that way.
Well, I mean, the question is, okay, let's do all the physics we can do. So the problem is, the physicist can just add in some metaphysical principles. Well, not as a physicist, right? You can't, and I can't add a metaphysical principle. Too late in the day over here. It's probably too late over there. I can't add a metaphysical principle into a physical model and have it still be a physical model.
Right.
So
exactly.
the question is, all right, when we've reached the end of what physical models can do, and fine-tuning is kind of a test run, right? We don't think we're at the end, but let's just test it out. But when we're at the end of what physical models can do, will we, as one group thinks, who I'll just call the naturalists, will we just be done? Like, don't do any more metaphysics, that's all junk, right? Or can we start to, is there more left to explain that some additional metaphysical principles or a hypothesis like God exists will do some more explaining work that'll actually have positive, probabilistic value? So I think that's the question there. And for that to be true, there has to be some sort of reason why this set of metaphysical principles is more likely than that. I don't think we're totally stuck that you can just throw whatever set of metaphysical principles together and everyone's totally happy, right? A God who has as a necessary property that he likes the cards, the 2 of diamonds and the 5 of clubs. No one's buying that. So I still think, there's a lot to think through over here, but I don't think we're in that totally skeptical position where everything's up for grab within metaphysics.
I would disagree slightly, because I don't think there's any kind of justification in human knowledge that can make those claims about metaphysics. And I think, there's actually particularly good reasons to reject a God, kind of like the problem of suffering. I would say it's probably more likely that whatever this metaphysical truth is, it's probably impersonal and impassionate. So even if it has like a moral law, it has no consciousness, which would explain why there's so much suffering, as opposed to an all-good, all-powerful God who for the suffering to exist would be a problem, because he probably would have created a world where there isn't any involuntary suffering.
Right, so a massive can of worms. Let's just tear that right open. Yeah, so the interesting thing is this the kind of universe you'd expect? Very naturally, obviously, wouldn't God just see the cancer in this universe and just put it back on the shelf and think, I'm not touching that one? So, but that's an open question. But if you think, see, here's the thing. If you think you can get any sort of handle on that question, then you have to weigh up. I mean, the big question is, will we expect this kind of universe? And so if you want to play that, either you play that game or you don't. If you do, then bring it on. Naturalism's got to ask that question as well, and it's going to hit fine tuning, right? Theism's going to ask that question. It's going to hit the problem of evil, and you're just going to have to weigh it up. And there's no kind of a priori, there's no simple way of thinking about that that's going to tell you how to weigh up those 2 options. You're just going to have to sort of think it through. But if you can generate those sorts of expectations at all, right, then you're in that game, and this game makes some sort of sense. And in particular, you can think about metaphysical principles. You're thinking about whether God is likely or unlikely, or whether he's going to produce that sort of thing. So you can't. If you had, you said near the start of your answer that there aren't good reasons to do anything over in this metaphysical side of things. If you had a decent proof of that, then that would really be something. But I mean, that would require a metaphysical proof with metaphysical evidence. It sort of shoots itself in the foot.
Well, actually, just to object there slightly, it's the difference between epistemology and ontology. What exists, there is definitely some metaphysical things that exist, but we can show that our epistemic basis is lacking and does not provide us any justification to claim what that is. So like the problem of underdetermination and induction in science show that even given all the evidence of the natural world, we can't make any claims about metaphysics, because there could always just be more stuff we haven't discovered. And that same problem of induction and underdetermination exists in every field of human knowledge. So in a priori knowledge, we have the problem of the criterion, the problem of easy knowledge, the problem of universals, Agrippa's trilemma, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, Tarski's indefinability theorem, Russell's paradox, all kinds of things that exist in every form of human knowledge, like even linguistics, the natural ambiguity of language and the interdeterminacy of translation. So just every field of human knowledge shows that we have this gigantic block between us, our epistemological means of knowing, and ontology. So I think we have a pretty solid basis to conclude that nothing we can say, that we don't have the epistemological ground to say anything about ontology. And the way to demonstrate that would be to say, any claim you make about ontology and metaphysics, I can just invert it and so show it works for infinitely many alternatives. So instead of theism, it could be pantheism. So just like you can have a God who has this property of morality, who makes it likely to produce a universe like ours, I can say there's this natural pantheism that has this property of this undiscovered law, which it could then determine is determined or likely to produce a universe like ours. And so even though the God may have intentionality and be doing it for a reason, the universe is necessarily determined to do it for a reason as well, even if it's not a why reason, it's a how reason. So it seems like either way we can just start explaining these things from different metaphysical perspectives to get to the same results with the same probabilities on either side.
You said in there that underdetermination and sorry, what was the other one?
Induction
underdetermination in physics tell us we can't do metaphysics.
Right. So I would say that we could be in the matrix, so everything in physics could just be wrong.
Right. No, hang on. But that means why doesn't induction and underdetermination mean we can't do physics?
Oh, we can still do physics. We just can't say it's metaphysics. We can't say it is the fundamental nature of reality. We can only say it's true insofar as our empirical methods can demonstrate, but we can't say it's true fundamentally about reality.
Fundamentally about reality.
So for example, we could all be being deluded by Descartes' demon, and the world we see around us is just an illusion, and there's nothing fundamental about it.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I mean, the question is not. You said for any metaphysical claim, you could apply it to something else. The question is whether you can apply it with equal plausibility.
Right, and I'm saying we can apply it with the exact same probability. I can match your probability, whatever it is, from 0 to 1 in a Bayesian epistemology for theism and pantheism.
Yeah, that is exactly what I'm doubting. So for any set of cards, I can produce a hypothesis that Jane, has a fondness for that set of cards, right? I can produce that hypothesis. What I can't do it with equal plausibility, right? And you don't get to.
Well, let me see if I can take that. I can say that the cards are magnetized at the bottom, and so you're always going to get that result of those exact cards. So it's determinate. So it seems like I can match the probability under a natural hypothesis.
These sorts of skepticism would eat physics, though. I don't see how you don't. I mean, if I can always. I mean, this is the problem of underdetermination. There's always more than one theory that predicts something. If that was the end of it, and there wasn't other things like simplicity, Occam's razor, those sorts of things, then physics would be sunk, right? But so the question is, so what I've been trying to argue is these other alternatives to theism that you're putting forward. For me, it's not obvious, and yeah, for me, it's not obvious that they have equal plausibility. They've produced the same likelihoods or similar likelihoods, but only in the kind of jerry-rigging way that the Jane hypothesis, Jane likes those cards hypothesis, produced the same likelihoods.
Right, I agree. And from my perspective, I see that the theist is kind of doing the same thing and rigging the system to try and imply the theist God. So I agree that we shouldn't make any claims that pantheism and theism are both unsupported. They seem both just ad hoc assertions to try and make the theory work. And
so then theists rigged the system 3,000 years ago.
What do you mean?
Right. Well, the fact that there is some sort of natural connection between whatever necessary being there is and goodness, which is kind of enough to run the fine-tuning argument, right? I mean, that's in a whole host of religions a couple of millennia ago, as opposed to Philip Goff, emails me about panpsychism last year. Yeah, hang on, man. You clearly, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not true that necessarily means that his theory is jerry-rigged. Okay, all it means is it's good evidence that theism is not jerry-rigged. If that principle that we need, some connection between ultimate reality and goodness, is one that was proposed before fine-tuning came along. In particular, so John Leslie has this idea called axiarchism, which he puts forward in a number of places. The one I'm familiar with is his book about fine-tuning called Universes, which is 1989. So axiarchism, so far as I understand it, which I don't, is the idea that the fact that something is morally good is enough for it to exist. So that's a sufficient reason for something to exist, is that it is a morally good state of affairs. Okay. Now, at this point, I'm doing the I don't understand finger from the back as well. But the other thing to say about this is, you might, you might be suspicious that you sort of came up with this idea rather late in the game. That at least puts axiarchism and theism, potentially on a different basis. It's not obvious that the battle between them will be a deadlock.
Well, so to take your example of morality, it could be that morality is just an emergent property of our emergent brains, and it's not a fundamental property of nature. So why would it would be like if I said puffins exist in the universe? Puffins are just something I made up. Therefore, the puffin god exists, or something. So why would that increase the probability that a god exists if we have no like empirical data that shows this moral property of the universe?
Okay, so I mean, I'm not attempting a moral argument here. I'm not saying because there is morality, therefore there must be God. I think that's an interesting argument. It's just not what I'm doing here. Yeah. So for me, the goodness of God is part of the hypothesis that we're then looking at fine-tuning with. Our personal experiences of morality just are nowhere in that matrix of things. If you could prove that morality was nothing more than a human construct, then obviously you couldn't assign it to any ultimate being, right? Like left-handedness or something, right? We wouldn't expect God to be left-handed. Then that would be something else. But that's not. I mean, if that argument's on the board, then again, that's not in my wheelhouse. But that would be an argument against fine-tuning.
Oh, so let's take a different example. Let's say there is a hunger god, and there's this hunger god who would produce a universe that is highly likely like ours to produce beings with hunger because it's the hunger god. So is that explanation equally as probable as the morality one?
So there's a really great argument, two good articles by John Hawthorne very recently. One called "Misapprehensions About Fine-Tuning" and one called "Fine-Tuning, Fine-Tuning." And I can't believe I didn't think of that title. But those are really great. So he discusses these ones quite good. He discusses what he calls the god of tungsten, who just really loves tungsten, just wants to make a universe with tungsten in it. And the point he makes is that within Bayesian probability theory, within probability theory, anytime there's any evidence, it's going to increase the likelihood of some weird theories, inevitably. That's always going to happen, right? And so I can see a pigeon out the window. That increases the probability that the god of pigeons has sent me a pigeon, right? So you just have to deal with that. So every one of those, or that there is some physical necessity that pigeon is there. It increases the probability that actually the little food bowl I have there has become magnetized, and that pigeon is also magnetized, and it's stuck to it, right? There's just 1,000. So the way we sort these through is that there has to be some sort of that the likelihood is not the only part of the story, right? There has to be some other principle. So if we're totally stuck within metaphysical states and we can't decide whether God would want a hungry universe or a good universe, then there's only so much fine-tuning can prove. But in fact, the point that Hawthorne makes there quite well, and I think Isaacs, sorry, there's two authors. I think it's Isaacs. The point he makes there is some of these weird hypotheses just sort of dissolve out anyway because they're so specific, right? They're like the Jane likes these cards hypothesis. And so those ones dissolve away. And in the case of the fine-tuning argument, actually, we don't have to assign a probability of 1 to what's the probability that God would want to create a life-permitting universe given that God exists. That doesn't need to be 1 in order for the fine-tuning argument to work. It can be 1 in a billion and the fine-tuning argument still works. So God of hunger, God of tungsten, those sorts of things don't make much of a difference.
Well, how is the god of hunger and the god of morality any different? Why would the god of hunger be any more of one of those particular examples than the god of morality?
Um, Sorry, can you phrase that question again? I'm not sure I got it.
You said that we can rule out certain hypotheses because they're too hyper specific, like the food bowl and the bird are magnetized, so they come
Oh
together.
no, yeah.
So
So
how?
no, hunger wouldn't be. Hunger's nice and general, right? So that's not hyper specific.
So what
So
would the difference
a
be?
god who likes the fine structure constant to be 1 over 137 point da, 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 right? That one's. I mean, it's usually fairly obvious when that sort of thing happens.
Right. So what would be the difference in probabilities between the god who wants hunger and the god who wants morality?
Um, See, the worst case scenario is if you gave them equal probabilities, right? And if those were the only two options, and they each get a probability of a half, and fine tuning the argument still works. Theism still beats theism with I don't know what God's intentions are, still beats naturalism. So, you could again do the let's have a survey of world history and see how many religions want a god of hunger and how many don't, and maybe there are some, and just whatever those numbers be, it's not those probabilities just won't affect the total state of play.
So the number of people who believed it is indicative of the truth of the thing?
No, I'm using the history of world religions, that just the history of theism, to try and get a handle on how ad hoc something is. And in particular, the question was, given this idea of God, can we add on to it a God who wants morally good beings in his universe? And how natural is that connection? And so all I'm offering is, well, I think it's pretty natural anyway, but people were making that connection well before it was needed in any sort of design argument. People who were just thinking about God within the context of a religion, surrounded by people who were all in the same religion, were all just worshipping the same God, they made that connection. So if you want to say it's ad hoc, you're going to have to produce a specific argument.
All right, so my argument would be that it's just anthropomorphism, where we look at properties in ourselves and we try to attribute those properties to the universe, and we have no reason to believe that the properties that we attribute to ourselves are fundamentally true about the universe. So it seems to me just to be an anthropomorphism. So there's no reason to believe that anthropomorphism corresponds to reality.
The probability that matters is, what's the probability that God would make a universe with moral beings in it, given that God exists? That's the one that matters for the fine-tuning argument. And so so I think there's sort of a package deal there. If God would make if God made a universe in which moral beings existed, then there'd be, it's not particularly unlikely that there'd be these analogies, these pointers back to God. So there's a theory here that you have to kind of work as a package. It's sort of a package deal. How do I want to say this? It's, if you've got a proof, if you've got evidence that our how did you put it? If you've got evidence that that we are just projecting things, that there's nothing up there, then go for it. But it seems like that would just have to be an argument against the existence of God. I don't see how you prove that just out of the middle of nowhere. I mean, within the theist worldview, it's not unexpected that there is some analogy between what we think and how God is, given that he made us, and if he wants us to relate to him in any way, then there's got to be some sort of connection. So that step within theism isn't a particularly hard one. So there's not an internal problem there. So if you want to create an external problem, you're going to have to bring in some sort of evidence that this is the case. And it seems like that evidence would have to just be an argument against the existence of God. If you want to prove there's there's no one on the other end of the phone line. You're just going to have to go to the other end of the phone line.
Well, I see it as the other way around. It seems like a burden of proof to me that if you claim there is this thing, that you would have to provide some evidence for it and not just use it as a prior probability in a Bayesian metric. So unless you can provide evidence that there is such a thing, independently of the anthropomorphism extension on our universe, that I don't think it's reasonable to believe it, to even put it into a Bayesian epistemology as a reasonable possible explanation.
Yeah, so the problem is I quite like the Bayesian epistemology. You can't, you set up here's the evidence we have. Here's the God hypothesis. What's the probability of God given the evidence we have? As part of that, you're going to have some sort of prior probability of God, and you're going to have to see how God deals with the evidence. If you have to introduce extra hypotheses along the way, we can deal with that. You sort of average over them in the Bayesian way. You ask how probable those assumptions are going to be. You sort of churn through all that algebra. I'm not sure how you end up with the point where you sort of get halfway through that process and you go, hang on, then there's no prior here in the first place. I mean, if you're going to pull the rug under that, the problem is you end up pulling the rug under the whole Bayesian enterprise, including its, all of its. What's the prior probability that general relativity is true before you've looked at any evidence? Do you think there is such a thing? Because if you don't, then the whole thing falls over. But if you're happy with, it's the way the universe could be, there's a certain simplicity and niceness to it. It connects with nice, geometric properties. If that's enough, then evidence can start to mold the probabilities relative to each other, and you can actually get somewhere and decide something. But to say you can't even get started is quite an extreme position, I think.
All right, totally, I agree. When I'm talking about my position on Bayesian epistemology is that you can only really apply it to things that have an empirical basis. So if you're adding new things in, like if you try to use Bayesian epistemology to decide how many more leprechauns can stand on the head of a pin than angels, I mean, it can't apply. There's just no reasonable way to assess that kind of a question. So if you're talking about things that don't have an empirical basis, like leprechauns or angels or properties of an all-powerful metaphysical being, then it seems completely arbitrary to even put that in as an equation, because it's just based on prior probabilities. You're just essentially making stuff up to make it fit the conclusion you want. So unless it has an empirical basis, I don't think it's even potentially a reasonable conclusion in Bayesian epistemology.
So again, the problem here is within the prior probability of general relativity. Okay, that's precisely the probability before we have any evidence. It's precisely the probability before we know whether leprechauns exist, or leprechauns don't in fact exist, but they could exist, right? I mean, see, here's the problem with that. 10 seconds from now, leprechauns could dance in front of you for an hour, and you wake up tomorrow and they're still there, and you're thinking, well, maybe I'm still hallucinating, and then all your friends come over and you take videos, and everyone, if you've not got a prior probability of them, then the evidence won't lead you to saying, oh, turns out after all leprechauns did exist. They were just hanging out to prove someone wrong in an argument. Again, you've got yourself into a situation where no amount of evidence would change your mind. God couldn't do anything because you've stuck his probability effectively at zero, or you've refused to give him, sorry, I'm refusing to give you a prior. I don't care how many people you raise from the dead. And again, you've got yourself in a bad epistemic situation.
Right, I'm making a little more of a specific claim. From my perspective, for Bayesian epistemology, for the probability to go up above, like as close to zero as it can possibly get without being zero, you have to have empirical evidence. So if I said I prayed to God and give me a gold brick and a gold brick and prize in front of me, that's empirical evidence. The probability goes up. If I said I pray to God and this person rise from the dead, that's good evidence. The probability goes up, and we can start getting the probability up to a much higher percent. But until we have those empirical kinds of testable, falsifiable ways to verify that this thing is a reasonable hypothesis, then I don't see any difference than saying, well, it's like a leprechaun or a unicorn or an angel or something. It's so close to zero because we don't have any basis there to assess it, that it can't really be used as a reasonable conclusion, no matter what else you see, until we get those future predictions in there that we can say that if this is true, here's a future thing we can test and show it's repeatable.
Okay, what if your friend says, I prayed to God for a brick and then a brick showed up?
I would not believe him until he could do it again. Do it again and let me see it. And if you can do it repeatedly,
Oh, so you've got to see it, but doesn't his testimony get you? I mean, all you need is epsilon, right? Doesn't his testimony get you to epsilon? A small number greater than zero. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Well, can you hear me now?
Oh yeah. Okay.
All right, so it starts above. It can't. If it's at zero, you're right. Then it just is always at zero. You can't give it above zero. So let's just put it as close to zero as possible. Now, if my friend prays to God and sees a brick, the first thing you have to establish is this imaginary or is this something a part of the world? Because we have problems with our mind. So you'd have to have some other methodology to first demonstrate this actually happened and wasn't just an imaginary thing. And so I would use science to demonstrate that. And so if you could make novel, repeatable, testable predictions, and you could show that the praying to a god gets a brick, then with scientific, repeatable reliability, then that would then raise it to a much higher level, like above 50%. But if it's a single example, then no.
I'm not sure how this whole thing fits together. We're off. This is like 4 more hours of conversation. I mean, you were saying before, I mean, if it's testable and repeatable, you might say, hang on, well, we just happen to be in a universe where if you say the Lord's Prayer and then say, a brick, please, those sound waves happen to create a golden brick. But that's a law of nature. In fact, that's a Humean must say that, right? I mean, it's repeatable, right?
I'm not, I wouldn't say that. I'd say anything that gives you future testable predictions exists and is real. So if I said there is a round square and this round square can be used to make future testable predictions that turn out to be right because it was the first theory that predicted it, I'm going with round squares. Round squares exist. So the fact that you can post hoc explain something would not be evidence to me. It has to be a future prediction that we don't know yet.
Okay, interesting. So the claim was, just to put this in, sorry, no, you say something because I'm.
So if you made future testable predictions about the supernatural, I will accept the supernatural if it can be verified. So I'm not a metaphysical naturalist who rejects that miracles are possible or that supernatural is possible. So anything that those testable predictions, I'm with you if you can verify it.
Okay, as a cosmologist and an astronomer, we don't put a high level of importance on the future. That's not quite right. Repeatability is not that important if you're a cosmologist and you have one universe, right? There's one cosmic microwave background that we have here, but we can still do things with it. In particular, this there's a problem called the problem of old evidence, which is supposedly there for Bayesians. I don't think it's complete furphy, but so here's the thing. The way that Mercury goes round doesn't quite fit with Newtonian, but we knew that in the 19th century. And then along comes Einstein and says, I've got this new idea of gravity. How's Mercury going to move? And he nails it, right? Gets it exactly right. It's a very small difference, actually, but it works. And so the problem of old evidence is supposed to be, well, we knew that the way that Mercury orbited all along, and so the probability of that is just 1. And so adding general relativity doesn't change anything. So I don't see it. I think if you're right, if you're being consistent, you should give past miracle claims plus eyewitness testimony non-negligible. You'll give it epsilon.
Above 0, yeah. As close to 0 as possible. But just to be clear,
right.
I'm pretty sure that in the case of the Mercury example, the reason general relativity was accepted was the novel predictions about the difference between the bending of light around the curvature of the sun as one of the first predictions. And it wasn't specifically that it could explain Mercury. That wasn't why it was accepted. It was accepted for the novel predictions of the of the bending of light around the sun.
I think physicists give those equal weight. Actually, historically, that's a really interesting one. I think physicists, So no physicist sees that as a problem, right? The thing about future predictions, the reason why they're good is you can't make them ad hoc. You can't secretly fiddle things behind the scenes to make your theory predict this one thing because you didn't know it yet. So you ask then, does it look like general relativity is the kind of theory where you could fiddle things behind the scenes and explain the perihelion shift of Mercury? And the answer is absolutely not. There's no free dials there. You've got a sun, you've got a planet, it goes around at a certain distance. Where does the orbit go? There's no, you can't even change G, the gravitational constant. There's literally no free parameters. You either get that right or you don't, and he gets it right. And that is the question to ask. The question of whether the evidence came before or after is completely irrelevant. So my point then is just historically, that's really interesting. I want to look into that now. But logically, no physicist would say, actually, you know, in general relativity's case, this one is more important because it came after.
Well, let me use a different example then. Let's go with modern physics. Right now, the most popular interpretation of quantum mechanics is the Copenhagen interpretation. And the reason is because it was the first one that made the most recent novel testable predictions with delayed quantum erasure experiment. Now, all of the other theories, the de Broglie-Bohm pilot wave theory, the many worlds hypothesis, the multiverse, M theory, string theory, whatever that gobbledygook is, they all can post hoc explain everything equally as well. But the reason the Copenhagen interpretation is the most popular is because it made the future predictions. It got it right the first time.
I completely disagree. Interpretations don't make predictions. Quantum mechanics makes predictions. No, not buying that one.
Wait a minute, because I remember the debate between Bohr and Einstein was that Einstein was saying that that it's determined, and Bohr was saying it's probabilistic, and then you do the delayed quantum eraser experiment shows that Bohr was right, and it's probabilistic, and it's not determined like the SOX thing that Einstein was talking about.
No. So, okay, any experiment that can be explained with the Copenhagen interpretation can be explained with Bohr's pilot wave, right? There is a deterministic theory of quantum mechanics which explains every quantum mechanical experiment. Okay, so there cannot be an experiment, a quantum mechanical experiment, which proves indeterminism. Okay.
Oh, absolutely, totally agree.
Right.
Totally, but I'm just saying the Bohr interpretation was first. It made the testable predictions first, before the other ones did. It was the one that was being used to make the predictions of the outcomes of the quantum eraser.
I don't think. Okay, so I've recently read Adam Becker's book, What is Real, which gave a nice sort of history of these things. Have you read that one?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's pretty good. So yeah, again, we're slightly outside my field here, right? Astrophysicist. But my understanding of it is that just the discussion between the interpretations, the Copenhagen people never said, hey, we were first. We made the predictions. They said, you know, like Bohr never argued in that kind of way. It was more along the lines of, actually, yeah, one of the points of the book is that it's really hard to work out what Bohr was actually trying to argue. But I think I saying that people who had a Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics predicted a certain outcome of a certain experiment, doesn't mean that the interpretation predicted the outcome, because it's the quantum mechanics that predicts the outcome, because different interpretations will predict the same outcome of the experiment. We're, yeah, although totally confused by quantum mechanics. Don't ask.
Well, there was another point you brought up earlier where if one person sees an eyewitness testimony and there are past accounts of miracles, should I give that a higher probability? Now, my response to that would be, if I told you I saw a dog, that would be reasonable to believe. If I told you I saw a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe. The difference between these two cases is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis. There's lots of things about dogs that we've verified in the past. So if it were to be reasonable to believe that I saw a unicorn, I'd have to actually present you with empirical evidence of a unicorn, some future kind of testable predictions that we can verify. And until I do that, no amount of eyewitness testimony would even budge. It would still be as close to zero as possible, because we have eyewitness.
No amount of eyewitness testimony?
No amount, and here's why. I can give you hundreds of cases of eyewitness testimonies of Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. I can give you thousands of Ouija boards and certain kinds of supernatural experiences. I can give you tens of thousands of Hindu miracles and other kinds of supernatural experiences around the world. I can give you hundreds of thousands of eyewitness testimonies, or hundreds of thousands or millions of homeopathy working. And I can give you if I show every single human being a picture of an optical illusion who's ever lived, they'll all see it moving. So from my perspective, the number of eyewitness testimonies is totally irrelevant. It has to come with future testable scientific predictions.
We are a long way from where we started. So the reason we got here was your claim that in order to have any prior probability, there's got to be something future testable, predictable about, that is the terrible English, that produces future testable predictions from the God hypothesis. And so, there was the problem of, you could always explain those naturalistically, but let's leave that. So what I was going to say is, okay, if all you need to get is just epsilon above 0, then, it seems like it's not, you don't just need epsilon. There's some standard you've got in play of you got to get above here, and then I can take you seriously. Maybe it's not a probability. There's it's the quality of the evidence. So it's got to be the future. I think that's. So what I was going to say is, I think there's more to be said about what you just said about eyewitness testimony, but I think actually there's a methodological principle here rather than a purely probabilistic epsilon that I've got to get above.
Right, it would be categorical instead of probabilistic.
Yes, yeah. So that's what I'm thinking. So, in that case, I think I'd want to say something like you're implying a standard from science which is sort of outside of its rule. If God exists, then that's the wrong standard to apply, right? You've sort of got yourself into a hole. There are things that we know. I point to the example of astronomy and cosmology as not being things where you do experiments and predict how future experiments will be. There are sort of predictions, but everything's happened already that you're interested in. So I think, and even then, you're applying a standard from science, which is appropriate only to study the kind of things that science studies. So if you have mindless, non-conscious matter which just obeys simple laws, then it's reasonable to put in. You can afford to have this nice threshold where you say, all right, I want to know what your experiments are going to do tomorrow. The question is whether you should apply that to everything in life, including potentially where there's a God or not. And I'd suggest that that's just the wrong way to go. So I suppose in your view, the reason why so many people believe in God in the first place is because they didn't apply this cutoff and then took evidence the wrong way, and so they started in the wrong place and then shot off in the wrong direction, right?
Well, this is from an epistemology I wrote, so it's a consequence of my personal epistemology. But my starting point is that I think therefore I am, and there's some difference between my imagination and my experience. When I imagine a unicorn, I don't see one in front of me. So the first thing you have to do in any epistemology of any kind of knowledge at all is you have to show it's not just something in your head. You have to come up with some methodology to do that. The methodology I use is the scientific future predictions. It may not be the only one, but it does work to differentiate between that stuff in your head and the stuff in the world. So I would say that the criteria that you're using, I don't know how that can differentiate between stuff in our head and stuff in the world. So for example, just to come up with the hunger God hypothesis, that's clearly just something in my head. I don't suppose that actually exists. But how would we differentiate this something from my head from your hypothesis of this moral God thing? It seems to be equally something in my head. How do we show it's something in the world? And I would require testable predictions to show one is true and one is imaginary.
Okay. I think the answer to that would be just future testable predictions is one application of Bayes' theorem. That's fine. So I think really what you're saying is that you should give God a low prior probability by all means. Okay. it's just, how low that is we can discuss. What fine-tuning, if this argument works, all it means is that once you've thrown that into the mix, right, the probability of God goes up by an enormous factor and the probability of naturalism goes down by an enormous factor. You might still have naturalism on top if you put your prior of God low enough, but then you're still reasoning reasonably, right? I mean, that's if that's the number that comes out of Bayes' theorem, then that's what comes out. You will want to think hard about your assumptions there, but I think that you can't update a probability you don't have. You can't test a hypothesis that you don't have a prior probability for, even using future testable predictions, right? Those predictions don't go back and give you a prior probability, because if they did, it wouldn't be a prior probability, right? I mean, prior doesn't mean in time, it just means in the absence of this empirical data. So if I think there is a more general method here, and I think the worry that other hypotheses like the God of hunger might come out to be true as well is just that sort of generic, weird hypotheses always get picked up by any data, but you go with it. So there's a really interesting, if you look on YouTube, there's a debate between Tim McGrew and an opponent whom I'm just trying to find. Tim McGrew and someone called Zach Moore, where the question is just is it rational to believe in miracles? And what Tim does quite nicely is to say, all right, here's some rational criteria. There's a worry there when you're talking through miracles that, you've got your Christian miracles, but there's all these other miracles as well. And so what Tim does quite nicely there is, okay, let's just lay down a reasonable set of things about miracles. Like, what's the amount of time between when the miracle's supposed to happen and when it's first reported? That's a reasonable thing to think about. It's not going to totally decide everything. Okay. Lay down those criteria, then let's just look, let's actually do the work of laying out, what are these other miracles? Let's look at, Vespasian's miracles and Quetzalcoatl and all these other ones, and just see, if we've done our hard work, if we've actually put the effort in, and it turns out that when you rank the 10 most likely miracles, there's 10 different religions on the top there, then we've got a bit of a problem. But, we'll worry about that afterwards. So I think worries about, what if I make up this hypothesis and then I can't do anything with it? Well, all right, do it and see what happens.
All right, so I had a question for you about something you said earlier. You said, God has this intentionality, this intentional feature, and that makes a universe like ours more probable than a naturalistic universe. Now, I don't understand why that would make our universe more probable to have a intentionality, which is determined by God's nature, than to have just a natural property of the universe, which is determined by that natural property. Why would the intentionality make it more probable than just having some determined feature of that universe?
If you want to say there is a determined feature, right? That's like the, let's suppose that Jane has some particular hand that she particularly likes, right? If you want to fold that into your hypothesis, you have to ask the question, what is the probability that the specifically deterministic naturalistic feature, if that's even English, will lead us to this universe, or to a life-permitting universe rather than some other sort of universe? You've got to fold that in. And it's, if that was just as unlikely, if the probability of God wanting to make a life-permitting universe and the probability of that kind of naturalistic feature were in fact on equal grounds, then yeah, the fine-tuning argument would not work. The reason why I don't think it is just because, the whole point of naturalism is there are no principles above the ultimate laws of nature. And a principle which would single out this universe would be a very specific principle. It will be one of a whole host of other possible principles, because we have all of mathematics available to us. And the best handle we have on the size of that set of possibilities is the constants of nature, and we're back at fine-tuning again. So I don't see how, yeah, like I said, unless you have a specific example, I don't see how that you win that argument.
That's interesting. So I still, why is that so the fact that you present a specific example of God having this moral principle makes it more likely than having an ambiguous possible principle that we just haven't defined yet?
Okay, so the problem is that so at the level of fine tuning, the problem is with the constants. The problem is that the ones that create life are a very small subset of an enormous set of possibilities. And if you want to do that in terms of some principle, it seems like that principle would be one in an enormous set of possibilities. That's what creates the small probability. On the other hand, it doesn't seem like God might want to make a universe with moral beings in it. Doesn't seem like just one of an enormous set of possibilities for what God might want to do. You could invent other ones, but they wouldn't have the same plausibility as that basic one, right? There's the idea of a God. There's the idea that God is where goodness itself resides in some sense, which we'll ask everyone about, and they'll give us their opinion. And then, you know, a particular good outcome being agent, you know, the sort of being who knows what good is and can do good actions. There's nothing in that, you know, you could invent other things that God might want to do. What I don't think you can do is invent enough of similar plausibility with that one to create the kind of enormous possibility space that created the problem for naturalism. That's the claim.
So where does that plausibility come from? You said that God has this property, and this property causes him to make our universe likely. Now, it seems to me, I still don't see the difference between just saying there is this pantheism. This pantheism has a similar property that causes it to make our universe. Now, so I'm saying that the universe we see around us, there isn't a vast array of possibilities. There is only this possibility or within a spectrum of possibilities like this, which are determined by the nature of pantheism, just like God creating this moral universe are determined by the nature of God. So it seems like we can both say that the nature of
okay. Sorry, yeah, go on.
Oh, no, go ahead. If you.
I was thinking out loud. I don't want to cut off the question because I might not have understood it properly. But it seems like what you want to do over this side is cut out. You've got a principle which is going to cut out possibilities, and that's how you're going to make things better.
Right. Exactly.
I think that set of possibilities we have if we just vary the constants. Okay, they're all mathematically fine, mathematically consistent, right? And so now we got to think, okay, what's the principle here that's going to do it? And I think if you say, okay, there is some principle that does this, then there could have been other principles. You've just shifted the other constants things up a level or down a level. I've forgotten which way I was doing that earlier. I think it was down a level, wasn't I? We'll put a different escalator in. It's the number of it's the vast array of other possibilities that makes the difference. So you're going to need your principles got to really come in at a very deep level. It's not any kind of physical principle because that's not what they do, right? Physical principles don't tell you how the world must be. So, and it's got to be something that rules out universes which are mathematically consistent. And it's got to do it in a way where you put up your principle. Here's your principle, right? Wonderful. There must be some reason why I can't generate a whole heap of other possible principles that could have been the principle of the pantheistic universe. Because if I make enough of those, you're back in this corner again. And so for me, this is all too hypothetical. If you've got some specific idea, then let's have it. But so axiarchism is that kind of idea. It turns out to be moral goodness. But if you've got some principle, then go for it.
Well, I'm doing the same thing with a god. You have this god who you've asserted this property of morality, and I can just say, well, no, it's actually a hunger god, or no, it's actually a spaghetti god, or no, it's actually a black hole god. So it seems like the same thing applies to both hypotheses. There are an infinite array of possible gods, and there are an infinite array of possible universes in the way it could be. We're just picking one.
No, but the one over here is not it's not that God likes our universe. There's a, God, goodness, moral agents. It doesn't, yeah. there is as yet no proposed principle over here. It's just what if they was, right? In particular, if you want to create that one-to-one mapping between the sides, right? You need to create something over here which has the sort of appeal, that's probably the wrong word, that the sort of natural connection that God, goodness, moral agent has over this side, right? And again, so I mean that if you want to create that sort of equivalence between the two, that's the task you've set for yourself. And so just saying I can do it over here, well, proof is in the pudding. Hit it.
Well, so I'd say the interconnection is between the natural law of pantheism and the boundary conditions, which are determined by this natural law, which then produces the particles. So just like how God has some property of morality, which produces a universe promoting to life, which produces beings who are capable of moral actions, the super law of nature has some property which makes it, which entangles all of the boundary conditions, making them interconnected, so they're going to produce a universe like ours just to produce particles or whatever. So it's just a determined outcome. Like God has a determined outcome by his nature. Pantheism has a determined outcome by the super law of puffins, let's call it, the super law of puffins that'll make the boundary conditions interconnected in the way they are.
Okay, but then, so the problem is that, the way I like to think of it is, the problem with the Jane likes those cards option is that hypothesis has a whole heap of siblings, right? So think of any 5 cards, right? And you can think of, Jane likes that cards or these 5. So there's 2.5 million siblings there who are all fighting over that one piece of the probabilistic pie, okay? And they all have equal grasp on it. And so the problem I have with, if there is some deterministic law that does this and produces our universe, is what if that law has other siblings, right? And this one over here, perfectly mathematically fine, right? The law can't say of itself, a physical law can't say of itself, the universe must be like me. There's no way to put that in an equation, okay? That's something that's got to come from outside. No, let's not say that. That's something that's not true within the law. I've made that point. So mathematically, if we go and look at all these other, there might be sort of this super law and then this other super law and then its sibling and its brother, and then there's a massive family of these that still creates the problem we have. It seems like over the other side, over the other side, there's no family, there's no massive family problem over here. I mean, there are, the god of hunger, there's gods, other brother, the god of hunger, but there's not a massive family over here in the way that there could be, especially if there's some sort of one-to-one mapping between the super law and our universe, right? You just create another super law, you have another super universe, you have a one-to-one mapping between the super laws and the universes on this end, and so all the probabilities just wash up and you get fine-tuning of the super law.
Well, so, you said something there. You said there's not a one-to-one mapping, that there's more possibilities on the super law than there are to the God's properties thing. I don't follow you there, because I seem there could be infinitely many on both, and equally infinitely many on both.
Okay, but yes, infinitely many, but not of the same plausibility. So, for example, if you just lay down some sort of, here's an equation, right? So, F equals G M1 M2 on R squared. There it is, right? If I say there's a possibility, and then I say, let's have the same equation, but with just R cubed, right? You might think, okay, those are similar enough that I shouldn't give them vastly different prior probabilities. They're siblings enough for me to sort of give them equal piece of the pie before we actually go and look at the universe. If you've got some super law, and it's very hard to do this kind of thing in abstract, with the laws as we know them, the way to make, so you have sort of the laws of our universe with the constants in there with their values. There's a very easy way of making this other, the family is you just change all those numbers. If you've got a super law, presumably there's no constants in there, otherwise we're back at the same problem. At which point, you've still got something. There's some mathematical structure, some mathematical equation. There's something going on in there, and given that it must be a particular thing, right? It must be, it won't have the whole of maths in it. You will still have all the rest of maths as well. But if there's no principle over the top of the whole thing, then it seems like there's nothing to tell you that this super law, rather than that other mathematically consistent super law, that those have any sort of different piece of the pie. Again, so the real point I want to make here is all of this is so abstract that we should be doing this kind of comparison not at this level where we don't know, but at the level of the constants where we actually can do it.
Shoot, sorry about that. So I would say, why doesn't everything you just said also apply to a God who has this moral property?
Just because there's no massive family, all the other.
But why do you think that morality?
There's a natural connection between God and goodness in the minds of basically every theist who ever existed, which is not there between naturalism and any particular law of nature. No one can start with a law of nature. No one starts with naturalism and says, this particular law is what I would expect the universe to be like. In fact, that's exactly the thing naturalism doesn't want to do. Whereas, for various reasons, but all, I think, probably in the same family, a load of theists have seen a very natural connection between God and goodness in that idea. There is some connection in that idea, whether it's Thomas, however you want to do that, which is not there on naturalism.
But why do you think it's not there? Because from my perspective, theists imagine that there is this connection between God and goodness. Why can't I just equally imagine that there is the same kind of connection between pantheism and the super law?
That kind of connection would have to be some sort of metaphysical principle that tells certain laws of nature, sorry, I know you're mathematically consistent, but you'll never get a universe. I'm sorry. It's just not your turn. I don't know what that would be. And in particular, it seems like if you're just if you want to throw pantheism in on the side, feel free. But if you're just a straight up naturalist, that's exactly the sort of principle you can't have. You don't possibly want any sort of that's some principle of reality which is above all of physics. I mean, the whole point of the naturalist is all of that stuff goes in the category of fairies at the bottom of the garden, right? So I don't think, maybe I don't have a particularly good argument here between naturalism and pantheism, and other than it seems like, sorry, I'm talking to someone. Say hi, this is Rosie.
Hi, how are you?
Sorry, you're in the headphones. All right, I need to talk to this person. I'll talk to you later. Bye. Close the door. Sorry.
PhD candidate?
I'm working on it. Got to build up your own army first. Yeah. And as usual, train of thought completely gone. I was probably talking about something totally interesting and going to settle this whole debate once and for all.
All right, so my last point was, why can't, so theists imagine that there is this connection between God and goodness. Yes. Why can't I say the same connection exists between pantheism and the super law?
Yeah, so I think, if I remember correctly, I was saying something about this principle has just got to say, I know you're mathematically consistent, but sorry, no universe for you. That sort of principle is going to have to be purely metaphysics. We're not doing physics, we're way out of Kansas now. And so, yeah, I think maybe I want to say that actually at that point, it's debatable to me whether you should call yourself a naturalist. If you've got some principle of reality which is not a physical principle, but which determines, at that level, it's determining everything, right? It's telling you what the entire physical universe is, but it's a metaphysical principle. You're not a naturalist. Who knows what you are? And if you want to shoot out at that level, then, have at it. All right. at least, fine tuning's done something interesting then, even if it's not solved anything. So yeah, maybe I just want to sort of say at the very least that discussion happens on other grounds.
All right, that's interesting. Just another related question. There can be natural things outside of space-time, can't there? There could be other kinds of space-time. I know you've argued against multiple dimensions of space-time, like Hawking's imaginary time and Itzalbar's two-time physics. But it is possible that there are other kinds of natural things that exist outside of space-time. Like Nima Arkhani Hammad has put in a theory of emergent space-time, where space-time emerges from some more fundamental natural property.
As a purely sort of empirical thing, yeah, we don't. I mean, there's no empirical sort of proof that there could be something. I know that there are some people who define material as whatever lives in space and time, but I think that's a bit. I mean, we could have a theory, yeah. There could be some theory in which space and time themselves are not fundamental, but are built out of something else. It's incredibly hard to think about what that possibly means, but like, how could you build space out of smaller things? But anyway, that's a possibility.
So wouldn't that be a possibility that I could say that the naturalist who wants to add in this metaphysical naturalism stuff and say, well, we can add in these natural fundamental properties that are outside of space-time to do everything that a supernatural thing outside of space-time can also do?
Yeah, so I mean, well, one example of this is perhaps we're a simulation. So this is sort of, if you want to semi-respectively talk about God within, and you're a naturalist, you talk about whether our universe is a simulation. So I guess that would be an example, because then our space and time would be like the space and time within, like, Mario as he jumps around. It'd be in our world in some. So I suppose that's a possibility. Again, I think fine-tuning only gets you so far, and if you wherever you start off, if you end up saying, so I think Geraint, my co-author, was a bit like this. He sort of never really understood this multiverse thing, and then saw the force of fine-tuning and went, oh, we better get myself a multiverse. That's a bit too harsh, but if you end up at the simulation hypothesis, yeah, maybe you've ended up where actually fine-tuning can't take you between those two options. You have to think about it on other grounds. Within a theist, you'd say, especially if you have a very high view of, necessity and God's properties being all bundled together in some sort of way, there is a unity in theism and a non-ad hocness that's not there within the simulation hypothesis. But again, we're on different grounds there. We're fine-tuning is limited to us to a very interesting subsample of the possibilities we might have thought we had.
And I had another question for you about, because you've criticized Vic Stinger's argument that even if we change one constant, it'll produce a non-life permitting universe. If we change many constants, it may produce many different possible variations of constants that can produce life permitting universes. Why would you object to that?
It's basically, it's false. It's just not true. The contention is that when fine-tuners do what they do, they change one constant at a time. And so in a parameter space, you're essentially, here's us, you're only ever moving in these specific directions. And it's just not true, right? It was false when he said it, in 2014. It's even more false now. There's a paper in 2006 by Max Tegmark, Aguirre, Anthony Aguirre, Martin Rees, and Frank Wilczek. So, professor at MIT, I think professor at California, the astronomer royal at Cambridge, and Nobel Prize winner at Harvard. He's at Harvard. Where's Wilczek? He might be at MIT as well. Anyway, they were just looking at how do you make structure in the universe. They just wanted to make some galaxies that weren't too dense and weren't too rarefied and that sort of thing. And so they considered a 7-dimensional parameter space with four dimensions from, so 3 dimensions from fundamental physics and 4 more from cosmology. and looked at every sort of carving through that space. Right, that was in 2006. So for Stenger to come along in 2000, I think it was 14, and say, oh, they're just varying one parameter at a time is just wrong. I mean, even the very early anthropic literature, so the Anthropic Cosmological Principle, 1986, by Barrow and Tipler, is sort of the classic. They go to great lengths to try and derive all of the formulas that they're going to use in as much detail as they can with all the constants in there. And so like there was never a time when like maybe the first paper by Brandon Carter in 1973, right? But since the early 80s, it's not been true that we're just varying one parameter at a time.
But would it be possible that if we do vary multiple parameters at a time, that a life-permitting universe could occur, but just on a different order of magnitude? Like, for example, beings who live their entire 100-year lifespan on the time scale of what we experience as zeptoseconds or something, or on a much smaller, like the entire universe being on the scale of an electron, and they're living their entire universe out on that scale as opposed to our scale.
The way you get around that is this is not always done properly. There are 4 constants that you want to set straight up and just set their value, set them to 1 or something, whatever you like. The best ones are the ones that give us the Planck constant. So Newton's gravitational constant, the speed of light, Planck's constant, h, and it only sets temperature, but Boltzmann's constant, so it doesn't really count. But with these 3 especially, those 3 constants then give you a unit of space, distance, and space, time, and mass. Right? Unit, the meter, the second, and the kilogram. Once you've done that, any change in the universe will not just make a scale model. Right? You've set things, you've used up that. So then if you go change the electron mass, you really are changing things. So it's then a sort of well-studied question. What stable things can you make out of the stuff of the universe? Right? There is an answer to the question, how can you put a proton and a electron together and make something stable? There's an answer to that. It's the hydrogen atom. There's only one way to do it. That's all provable within mathematics. So the more interesting one is, what if there's ways? There are some interesting cases where, for example, if you change the constants of nature, you take the energy you need for a nuclear reaction and the energy you need for a chemical reaction, which in our universe are a factor of 100,000 apart, which is great. You can't burn your cake and start off a nuclear bomb. You can bring those 2 together, so they're about the same. In which case you make the universe much more complicated, because any interaction, 2 atoms hit each other. They might have a chemical reaction. They might have a nuclear reaction and turn into something else. That's fascinating. You don't do a fine-tuning argument around that. No one has. You just point it out as, this is a pretty entertaining thing. I don't know what happens in that universe. We'll leave that one in the, maybe life could happen over there. It probably can, right? It might be too complicated, but who knows? The really solid cases are the ones where you have basic, either ones like the cosmological constant, where you just expand everything in the universe so fast that nothing is within 1,000 light years of anything else. Right? Everything's the really easy way to stop the universe doing anything is just to put everything too far away from everything else. Or there are some very simple arguments in particle physics, just purely to do with energy. If I put these things together, is there enough energy within them for them to rip themselves apart? And then you look at where those things happen, and if protons can't stick to neutrons, or more generally, if the lightest particles you have can't stick to each other, then you can't make anything in the universe. So you rely on very general arguments like that rather than anything specific.
Cool, interesting. Well, I'm actually falling asleep. It's 2 a.m. where I am. So I really appreciate you coming on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, that was really interesting. Your personal epistemology, just is that in a book or a paper or a...
Not yet. I've written it in a book. I haven't published it yet. I'm trying to get more subscribers on YouTube so I can sell more copies, get more popularity first. But yeah.
Interesting. All right.
Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I hope to talk to you later.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye.